Okay, very welcome to this presentation of the AIF, the Asian Infrastructure Finance Report of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The theme for this year's report is Moonshots for the Emerging World and transforming state capacity and mobilizing the private sector toward net zero. I will have a chance to present the report in a minute, but first I want to welcome our President, Jin Li Chun, to give a few remarks at the opening. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you. Good morning. AIIB was born in 2016 with 57 signatory founding members shortly after the Paris Agreement was signed at COP21. Now, at the 27th Conference of the Parties, the task of mitigating, adapting to climate change has become more urgent than ever. What do we hear and see these days? Rolling heat waves setting fire to huge green expanse of forests, droughts hitting vast areas where crops withered on the parched ground, floods submerging towns, farmlands, and destroying infrastructures, and so on and so forth. These catastrophes now never cease to sweep across our globe. They serve as a stern warning that climate change is not something just a fermenting, brewing, slow-moving, as used to be wrongly assumed. It is already visiting its wrath on humanity right now, right here. The serial disasters which took up much of the calendar in 2022 augur a future grim and full of danger, unless firm and effective actions are taken to drive the transition full throttle towards a global economy based on clear-cut net zero. Our bank's 2022 Asian Infrastructure Finance Report focuses on important and necessary actions on the net zero transition in emerging and developing economies, the countries which we work for. Climate change has a global impact, but wreaks more havoc with low-income countries. To draw an analogy of physiology, these vulnerable countries have virtually no defense mechanism, a process by which an organism reacts against pathogens and predators. It comes as no surprise that these economies take a pounding amidst climate change. Developed countries are under a moral obligation to provide financial and technical support to those low-income countries in the throes of the COVID-19 pandemic, high indebtedness, budget deficits, and other troubles. It is not just extending a helping hand to those countries in distress. Rather, it's to address this global challenge to safeguard the entire humanity. It is against this background that this year's Asian Infrastructure Finance was conceived. Our ambition was to provide a more positive and inspiring vision of the benefits that emerging and developing economies can reap from the net zero transition. But to this end, we must also not overlook today's disturbing realities. The report highlights the continued oversized investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as where private sector, innovation, and adaptation green tech have fallen short in emerging economies. Most countries have no effective carbon pricing, thus hampering the net zero transition. We are encouraged to see that policymakers are not ignoring uncomfortable truth, but rather they are taking a full frontal position against tackling these formidable challenges. This is also very much the spirit I have observed so far at COP27. The report is sobering and yet uplifting at the same time because it sets a vision and identifies opportunities for the state and the private sector to come together toward net zero, from a long shot to a realistic moonshot. For the globe to reach carbon neutrality, government must use every tool at their disposal. This includes, critically, effective engagement with the private sector, as our chief economist Eric would elaborate. Let me also say something about our cooperation with Egypt. Right from day one, when the bank was up and running, we put expectations on Egypt as the linkage between Asia and Africa, one of the transcontinental economies. Today, sitting in Sharm el-Sheikh, we're actually in Asia, not Africa. Very early on, we financed a large-scale solar project in Egypt, Nubian Suns, together with IFC. Climate change action is a global public good and something we must support in all our members. Egypt has a very close connection to Asia in trade and in the flow of workers. We have also supported social projects like water and sanitation because the well-being of the workers and their families affect Asia as well. During COVID, we also financed a recovery program under our crisis recovery facility. There's no doubt that we will continue to work closely with Egypt to support its development and its net zero transition. Let me conclude with a few key truths. Net zero is all of our joint business. No one can escape climate change. In this spirit, global cooperation is essential to ensure that finance, green technology, and needed raw materials are made available to the emerging world. This is also what the report is all about. The net zero transition will not slow down development at all. Instead, there is a historic opportunity to leapfrog into a truly sustainable form of development with green and sustainable infrastructure, and at the same time, save the planet in the process. It is self-evident that this region has huge potential in solar energy. Global cooperation is key for finance, projects, and renewables, and low-cost electricity to flow in Egypt and across the borders. This is the moonshot vision, not a drag on the development, but a rocket booster instead. Our bank, as a multilateral institution, will continue to play its part to deal with the past, manage the present, and most importantly, to build the future. Our institution's message is clear. We are here with you, and we will not fail you. We offer our unqualified commitment to stand with our members as we support their efforts to build a green infrastructure for tomorrow. The world's realization of the net zero future depends on it. Thank you very much for your participation in this event, and I wish it every success.
Thank you, President Jim, and very grateful for those short, always encouraging messages. So I'm going to present the report now in a few minutes. It's not going to do justice to the work of my team, but I will try to summarize the main messages. So I think being here at the COP and listening to the conversation, there's of course a lot of very justified complaints by emerging and developing countries about this world not delivering on its promises to provide monetary and financial support. There's a lot of complaints about constraints on their future growth and so on. And all these are very justified complaints. But I think there's also need for a more positive vision for how emerging and developing countries will deal with the net zero transition. And it's going to be important because otherwise, and the Secretary General said so much in yesterday's speech, that the emerging and developing world is falling behind in the net zero transition. And what this report is trying to do is to offer a vision and also showing that what net zero does is that it offers additional incentives to do those development reforms that we have been talking about for so long. So let me set the context first. It is very clear that in Asia, but beyond, there are very large fossil fuel footprints in the emerging and developing economies. And there's very little innovation and adoption of green technology in these countries. I don't know, is this background music to... Anyhow, we will proceed. So what we are offering is an approach to try to deal with these issues. And what we call a moonshot is really having a mission-oriented approach and focusing on enhancing state capacity that will use the state to transform the economy and enable and crowd in the private sector. And again, using net zero as the driving justification. And just to summarize what we mean by the net zero moonshot for the emerging world. So we think that these state-owned institutions, I'm talking now both about state-owned enterprises and state-owned financial institutions that are so overexposed to the fossil fuel sector, they need to go from laggards to leaders. They need to divest from fossil fuels, but they also must become leaders in terms of investing in renewables and in green technology in general. The private sector has a lot to contribute. It's not just about capital, it's about skill, experience, the dynamism that the private sector offers. And the private sector can often be part of building state capacity, and there are many examples of this. The third thing is the green innovation. We shouldn't expect emerging and developing countries to have a lot of the completely new green technologies, but they should focus on bringing in and adopting and absorbing new technologies, and that is going to be the focus for if they are going to meet the net zero transition. The fourth element is the carbon price, and that's going to be really the litmus test of the net zero transition in every country. It sends signals throughout the economy, it sends signals to consumers, to producers, it sends signals to innovators. It's absolutely essential. But the carbon price is not sufficient. We need to have coordination across sectors, across value chains. We need that to be driven by this mission, and we give us many examples of what that implies. And finally, and this is absolutely essential, this transition will not happen or will not be sustained if it's not done in a smooth and fair and just way. And that is absolutely critical to think about that as we do these reforms, particularly of the state-owned energy sector. So let me take a little bit a step back just to justify how we think of the moonshot approach. So it's very clear that the net zero transition everywhere, but particularly in emerging and developing economies, is the greatest challenge to state capacity we've seen so far. And of course, state capacity comes out of many things, and of course, state capacity is about the ability to raise taxes, but also the ability to invest in future and in growth producing infrastructure, for example. And for state capacity, trust in government is really necessary to get action and also to get compliance with rules. We need to try to encourage more thinking along common interest societies and just transition, and here's the sort of foundation why just transition is so central to the moonshot approach. And the state has very important tools. It has the state-owned enterprising. They are very important in almost all emerging and developing economies. They account for a very large part also of bond issuance. They have more advantageous financing conditions, and they are actually more advantageous relative to private sector in developing countries and emerging countries than they are in advanced economies. So we need to make use of that capacity in the net zero transition. The same thing with the state-owned financial institutions. They are cover a very rich set of institutions. They are, of course, state-owned commercial banks. There are national development banks, sovereign wealth funds, central banks. They all need to be brought into this net zero transition and part of the moonshot approach. And they can do different things than these development institutions can do different things than simple commercial banks and private sector banks, and that we need to make use of that and very much bring about partnerships with the private sector. That is the future. So I said that these institutions, state institutions, were overexposed to fossil fuels. So here's just two pictures from showing this for SOEs, comparing SOEs and the private sector. And you see here that the oil and gas, the kind of dark green here, is very much dominating in most of the countries, and certainly compared to renewables. And here is a similar picture showing investments that have one state-owned bank lender and those that do not. And you can see at the oil and gas really is much more represented among those with a state-owned bank lender. So bringing SOEs and state-owned financial institutions from laggards to leaders is about getting them into away from fossil fuel to renewables. In many countries now there is this distinction where private sector has gone into renewables and the state-owned sector is in fossil fuels, and you get this artificial distinction between the kind of very strong political power vested in fossil fuels and private sector pushing renewables. We need to make sure that these state-owned institutions also get involved in renewables, otherwise we won't succeed. We need to think about the whole value chains and greening the value chains, both in the production sector, but also in the financial sector, thinking how can we green the financial value chains. Here governance reform is going to be critical, getting transparency, getting verification of commitments to net zero of individual financial institutions and of individual enterprises. And we also think that state-owned enterprises and public banks, they have often a wider role in society. They can be used to forge new partnerships, collaborations, coordination across value chains. So there's a very strong role for SOEs and state-owned financial institutions. But this will never succeed without active participation from the private sector. And we can see, looking across the green infrastructure, that there is still a lot of addition to fossil fuel capacity in many countries, particularly in South and Southeast Asia. We see not enough investment in electric vehicles. Railroads are still very small, and very little investment in other low-carbon transport. So it is still a very nascent developments in green infra in Asia. So for the private sector to play this role that we think is so essential, certain things need to be in place. And again, it's actually about state capacity. It's about having the right state institutions in place and the right regulation. This picture here shows that if the regulator has put in place a rule that the most efficient supplier wins contracts, then renewables wins out in most cases. So the governance plays a vital role. Competitive bidding is critical, and of course robust contract management is also very important. The renewables are well known for delays in tendering and renegotiation. That the more the state is capable of handling that, the more likely renewables is to succeed. We look also in the report on green innovation, and we shouldn't expect a lot of that happening in emerging developing economies, because green innovation in the limited sense of, here we look at patenting, but what we should expect is the imitation and adoption and absorption of green technologies developed elsewhere, and that is still very much something that is a work in progress. And here we are sketching a number of elements of such policies, and carbon pricing is very central to that kind of system to encourage adoption of green technology. Carbon pricing sends signals that these technologies are to be encouraged, or to be used throughout the economy. What we also need to do, and again, as a multilateral development bank, we think this a very important role for us to ensure that the emerging and developing countries have access to finance and technology, have access to these green technologies, creating platforms, facilitating that exchange is something that could be a role for us. Let me say just a few more words about the moonshot and how it interacts with, sort of how it relates to state capacity. So you can say a lot of things about state capacity. I've summarized it in three words here: credibility, coordination, and expertise. And on credibility, it's about committing and enacting emissions pricing and reducing fossil fuel subsidies is probably the strongest single credibility commitment device that you can have. On coordination, having a dedicated body that really informs and monitors implementation, like the carbon councils or climate council that many countries have adopted. We think that is an important element of a moonshot policy. On the expertise side, having institutions that really focus on green technology adoption is one element. There are many different elements here. What I think is critical is the vision of net zero, making sure that you think across the whole of society, and of course the carbon price is absolutely critical to this coordination exercise. So we do very quickly, we do in the report look at this taken together in three different countries: India, Indonesia, and China. I won't have time to go into the richness of these individual chapters, but I'll say something very quickly about each of them, and then I'll hand over the floor to Danny Alexander. So India is a very interesting case, and of course was maybe off to a somewhat late start, but has made very important commitments that, as you know, in Glasgow, so net zero by 2070. You can see in India these very large variations, across SOEs, across non-SOEs within the same sector in terms of fossil fuel intensity. That suggests that there's a lot of learning, a lot of opportunities to improve on this, and a lot of opportunities to phase out the fossil fuels. What's very striking, and many people have noted this, but I think it is, when you really look at it in a comprehensive way, the role of the private sector in renewables is really remarkable, and it's something that happened in the last 10 years, and it's something that should really be watched and learned from. But as I said before, it has created this artificial distinction between the state being sort of in the fossil fuel sector and not in renewables. So there are now signs for Coal India, for example, now is diversifying into renewables. I think that's a very good sign, and we need to see more of that. And we have seen that, for example, in China also, where state-owned enterprises previously tied to coal and oil and gas are going into renewables, and that I think is a necessary development. Low carbon transport is still very much a nascent sector in India. Green finance also very much nascent, very small amounts of flows goes into renewables. State-owned banks actually here are quite present. The private banks are not very present. Very limited FDIs so far. Green bonds are just in the early stages, but can become a very important source, we think. If you look at Indonesia, Indonesia has, as you probably know, gone through a lot of different phases of its reforms of state-owned enterprises. It has created these holding companies. These holding companies are very important, particularly in energy, oil, and gas, but across all infrastructure. Getting them on board is absolutely critical for the net zero transition in Indonesia. One can say that in Indonesia, the renewables have not really caught on yet. There's a lot of room for improvement. I think PPPs have the frameworks are in place, but there's again a new need for more energy and more dynamism in the PPP sector. China, finally, China of course has had a lot of reforms of its SOE sector, and we look quite closely at these reforms, and the privatization element had a lot of positive impact on efficiency, but almost no impact on environmental performance. When they changed the evaluation of SOE managers to include environmental factors, we see a very clear improvement in environment. Private sponsors are very important when it comes to environmental PPPs, and what has developed over time in a quite interesting way, variation across China, different provinces, with the central government taking into account the differences in state capacity in different provinces, and shaping PPPs according to that, giving more autonomy and more possibilities to those with stronger state capacity. You know, there's been a lot of focus on coordination, using market and planning tools together and finding the right balance, and the, of course, introduction of the emissions trading system last year has been very important. There's still some lessons to learn from the pilots, and we discuss some of those in the report. Let me summarize what we mean by these moonshots for the emerging world. So the mission, the vision is absolutely critical, and that I think is where this applies across advanced, emerging, and developing countries. You need to have that vision. You need to think about how are we going to get there? Where do we need to build state capacity? How can we use those state institutions that we have to help lead this transition? How can we mobilize the private sector? Where can we find the skills, the capital to help build the state capacity? How can we use PPPs to develop those parts of the state that needs to be functioning to reach net zero? Develop technology adoption frameworks adjusted to local conditions. And of course, and here I think as an MDB we feel a very strong need to be part of this to facilitate access to finance and technology for emerging and developing countries. And of course, combining that with ensuring a smooth and fair transition. So let me stop there and hand over to Danny. Thank you very much.
So Eric, thank you very much indeed, and I want to congratulate you and our economics team on this year's Asia Infrastructure Finance report. It's really a very important contribution to the debate and to the discussion. And as you said, in a short event like this, we can't really summarize the depth and richness of the content. But I think, you know, in the context of this COP, and the agenda for this COP, this is really an important contribution, because the focus of COP27 is on implementation. The Egyptian Prime Minister in the opening ceremony said the focus was implementation, implementation, implementation. And another focus I think is on, and especially for us as AIIB, is on building the partnerships that are necessary in order to implement the commitments that countries have made, that multilateral institutions have made, and that the international community made in the Paris Agreement and also last year in the Glasgow Climate Pact. And so, as President Jin said in his opening remarks, we have to recognize that we are, as a global community, a long way behind in terms of delivering on those commitments. And that's why I think the Egyptian presidency's focus on implementation is so important and absolutely the right place to be. And in order to achieve the implementation, the requirement is to build the capacities in all the different parts of the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, to get to net zero. And so I think this report sheds considerable light on the range of things that are needed to build state capacity and the capacity in different kinds of state-owned institutions. And so I want to reflect a little bit on some of the conclusions of the report, and then also maybe just tell you a little bit about how AIIB as an institution is trying to approach this, and where we see that through our finance we can make an impact. Because I think that this report on the net zero transition is fully consistent with the corporate strategy goal that AIIB has to support green and sustainable infrastructure and to support alignment with the Paris Agreement. And I'll come back to what we're doing in a moment, but I think I'd maybe just highlight 4 key points from the report, where I think it dovetails quite neatly with also what AIIB is trying to do. I mean, the key focus is to say that we should work in an integrated way across projects and sectors. We should engage SOEs, state-owned financial institutions towards net zero, and by doing so, also help to crowd in the private sector. And AIIB has been working with a number of state-owned financial institutions precisely to help do that. So in India, we supported the creation of the NIIF, National Infrastructure and Investment Fund, and particularly we supported their Fund of Funds platform. That was an innovation in the financing system promoted by the Indian government, but bringing public and private sector together. And we thought it was right to support that innovation, which I think is starting to bear fruit in terms of financing for infrastructure projects, and especially for clean energy in India. Again, in India, another innovation that's been promoted through by the government and supported by AIIB is the creation of these INVITs, investment trusts, which are helping to accelerate the flow of bank capital back towards new projects by creating facilities that can then take on and own projects once they're operating for a longer period of time. And so this is an example of where states are seeking to build their own capacity or to enhance or change the financing system that they have, and where the support of multilateral institutions can be crucial to helping get that across the line. In China, we've been working with the China Exim Bank on an on-lending facility. China Exim Bank is one of the very large state-owned financial institutions in China, and a substantial part of the objective of that project is to seek to share and spread the reach of the environmental and social standards that AIIB applies to its projects, and by sharing that experience to help extend the capacity of that institution to invest in the net zero transition in the right kind of way. And we hope that by being a catalyst for high standards for projects, high environmental and social standards and others, AIIB can help to also expand the capacity of institutions like those ones to invest in the right kind of way. Second point I draw from the report is the recommendation to develop capacity to help build state capacity through projects and in programs supporting projects. And I think one of the themes here at COP27 is about the importance of country-level platforms, bringing together the governments, multilateral institutions, and other financiers with common objectives. So last night, a very important platform for here in Egypt was signed. The NWFP, the Nexus for Water, Energy and Partnership, which the EBRD, working with the Egyptian government, led, but other institutions, including AIIB, contributed to. And what that's created is a platform which will mobilize concessional financing to help to reduce capacity in the fossil fuel sector, and at the same time mobilize $10 billion of finance for new clean energy projects here in Egypt. So the net effect will be very substantial addition to power generation here in Egypt, and then in water and in other areas there are similar investment plans. And I think that that kind of collaboration at the country level, and we see it also with the development of the just energy transition partnerships in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, where again donors and multilateral financiers and other organizations are working together with governments. Those are examples of initiatives which are helping to support major developing countries to expand their own capacity and to mobilize the finance that is necessary for their clean energy transition. Third point I would draw upon, which I think is a key priority also for AIIB, it's one of the pillars of our corporate strategy, is the priority given to supporting green technology and technology transfer to emerging markets and developing economies. And that's something that AIIB has done through many of our projects, and we would see that as a major priority in future, to take technologies that are maybe being developed in one country or and transfer it to those members that don't necessarily directly have access to that technology. And that can apply in climate change mitigation, on technologies like hydrogen, storage, as well as the more established renewable technologies where having the capacity of multilateral institutions can help to accelerate the development. I think it also can apply in climate change adaptation and resilience. So again, one of the projects that I'm very proud of with AIIB is our investment in the Lightsmith Climate Resilience Fund. And that's a very innovative fund which is looking for new technologies in the adaptation space in order to scale those technologies and roll them out in the places where they are most needed. It's quite a rare example actually of also private capital being mobilized for adaptation and resilience. And then in addition to the integrated working together, developing state capacity, supporting green technology and technology transfer, the report also highlights the importance of supporting government-level coordination of state capacity building and technology adoption. And I think that's where multilateral development banks like the AIIB also have a very, very important role to play. Now for AIIB, if I can just turn briefly to how AIIB is seeking to work in this space. We see an important role for our bank, working with other multilateral institutions, to support our members to achieve the transition to net zero that those members have mapped out for themselves. And we saw in Glasgow last year many members making those commitments. I think 77 AIIB members have made net zero commitments and set timetables for that. So we've set out our own targets that by 2025, at least 50% of our financing approvals will be climate finance. That's both climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And that we will achieve full Paris alignment for all of our projects. Whether those projects are aimed at climate or whether they have another purpose, every single one of our new projects by the middle of next year will be aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that means in particular building in adaptation and resilience to every single project, which I think is a crucial goal and something that should be adopted in future by all financiers. We also recognize and see the imperative for scaling private sector finance to the level needed to achieve the 1.5 degree scenario. The IPCC, concluded that the current level of financial flows is 3 to 6 times lower than is needed. So AIIB has set the goal that by 2030, at least 50% of our financing will be for non-sovereign operations. And of course, we want to use that financing as much as possible to mobilize others also. And so that's why supporting partnerships like the one in Egypt that I referred to is so important. The report emphasizes the critical role that private sector finance has to play. And of course, developing the state capacity, the right laws and regulations and systems to enable private finance to flow is one part of that. But another part is also the role of multilateral development banks and other kinds of concessional finance to support the private sector. So at the asset level, we're working to facilitate private finance across Asia, including by de-risking projects, providing long tenor loans, first loss investment and guarantees. And at the sector level, we're looking to mobilize large-scale institutional investors by providing equity and debt financing to funds and financial intermediaries to spur targeted investments into technologies and frontier markets by creating capital market structures such as green bonds. And again, we see it's an interesting example where several governments are taking steps to try and promote the creation of green bonds. Eric referred to that in his presentation. And again, multilateral development banks not only can share their technical expertise, but also by acting as anchor investors can help to enable those initiatives to reach fruition quickly and successfully. I think one of the issues also that's been discussed quite widely at this COP is about the issue of incentives. What are the incentives necessary to enable investment to come forward at scale? We're looking at implementing sustainability-linked carry schemes to incentivize funds and financial intermediaries to increase their climate financing beyond the original goals. So for example, our investment in a multi-country Everbright infrastructure investment fund is enabling green infrastructure investments in emerging Asia and pioneering an innovative sustainability-linked incentive scheme to promote climate finance, gender diversity, and ESG governance in the private equity fund market. We've also approved $1.2 billion in green and sustainable bonds in Asia, including the Asia Climate Bond portfolio, as well as our Asia's award-winning Bayfront Innovative Infrastructure Private Capital Mobilization platform, which is also helping to support the goal of establishing infrastructure as an investable asset class in Asia, which is critical to mobilizing institutional investors into the climate space also. Now, another event on the 11th, here in the joint MDB pavilion, we will speak in greater detail on financing the supply chain of climate technologies for infrastructure for tomorrow. And on the 14th, next week, next Monday, also here, we will focus on the role of capital markets, and in particular the role of resilience bonds to unlock capital for adaptation and resilience, and announce one of the AIIB's new initiatives in this space. I'd just like to conclude by saying that, you know, a critical part of implementing the findings of this report is developing the right partnerships between government, multilateral institutions, the private sector, and also philanthropic organizations. By blending capital in the right way, we can help to stimulate and support some of the initiatives that governments in our member states, and especially in low and middle income countries, are trying to take. So yesterday, for example, we signed an agreement with GAP, the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, which is a multi-partner platform supported by a number of philanthropic foundations to accelerate the energy transition in developing countries, where up to $100 million of their finance will help to mobilize and support $1 billion of AIIB finance, which will then help to mobilize multiples in the private sector. And so I think by bringing those kind of finance together, we can support the also the capacity building at the state level that this report has focused on. And later today I will be signing the Energy Transition Accelerator Financing Platform, or ETAF, which AIIB is joining, which is a multi-stakeholder climate finance platform backed by IRENA and their technical expertise. And again, I think those kind of initiatives can support some of the goals set out in this report. So let me finish by again congratulating Eric and the team on the report, and I think it adds considerable value in the context of the discussions here at COP27 about how we can all raise our game in order to deliver on the goals that have been set out in the Paris Agreement and in Glasgow. If the goal of COP is implementation, 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 then what this report adds is the importance of building state capacity to enable the implementation to take place and to create the space for the private sector also to invest. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you for those supportive words. I don't know if there's any questions from the audience, or Ricardo here is. Yes, there's a question back there.
Hello. Sure. Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for your very inspiring speeches. My name is Duo Jialu. I'm from Tsinghua University. I'm a master's student, majoring in public policy for sustainable development goals. And I'm really interested in what AIIB is doing in terms of climate finance, but also I'm still wondering, in terms of climate finance, how the AIIB is dealing with the balance between financial returns and purely just tackling climate change, because sometimes they are contradictory, and how which one is the priority for an AIIB? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think this is a very good question, and we know that there are a lot of investments that are needed that will require concessional finance or finance that are, but at least my experience is from this that the more we can get the sustainable investments that are truly generating return, the more likely it is that this money will be crowded in and so on. So yes, we need more concessional finance, but we also need to make sure that we create opportunities that attract private investors and bring in that money. Danny gave a number of examples, I think, of how when you manage to create things that truly are market-based, and then you can scale it up in a way that is just not possible where you don't have enough concessional funds available. Just looking at the net zero transition, the amount of capital needed to make it possible, there's no way in hell that we can achieve net zero relying on concessional finance. That's why we need to think very deeply and think together, private sector and the state and multilateral institutions and so on. So how can we create the right clever mechanism to crowd in private sector finance? But you're right. I mean, we need a lot of money very quickly, and we need it now.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Joseph from Uganda. I'm working with the Banana Industrial Research and Development Center. And when he talked about implementation and about capacity, I'm seeing this at different layers of capacities, right from the institutions of state, from other organizations, but we deal directly with the farmers. I don't know how we would be able to actually implement in terms of technology transfer to these farmers that we normally work with in terms of partnership. So I'm looking at how does the NDB, the New Development Bank, be able to support. Because at the institutional level, there are certain levels of development capacities that we have been able to reach. But then at the lower levels, there is still a problem. And these are the people driving the whole process, especially in developing countries. So I thought you would give us and throw more light on how the different polycentricity of capacities, because the capacities are developed at different levels, but in order for the system all to work, we need to really look at the bottom-up approach and how we could influence this.
No, I think this is a very important question, a very important challenge. And I'll give you an example of something that I think can work and which is in line with what I just said, that how you can think about the relationship between concessional finance and private sector finance, and which I think also illustrates what you are trying to achieve. So I used to work at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and we were trying to roll out energy efficiency credit lines. So using, in order to reach the kind of entrepreneurs, small and medium-sized enterprises that you are thinking about, and maybe even individual households, how do you reach them? Well, it's very hard for a multilateral development bank to reach them directly. So you need to work through financial institutions, typically commercial banks. And what we managed to do with those credit lines, and I think this is a model that one can work, I would like to see implemented in many other places, is to there was a little bit of concessional finance in one country, this country where we started, it was Bulgaria. The concessional finance came from decommissioning of an old Soviet nuclear plant. And that money we could use to give a training to the banks to assess energy efficiency investment in these kind of small enterprises or entrepreneurial activities. And then we could give a little bit of incentive for entrepreneurs to come forward. And I remember there was this baker in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, and his company was about to go broke, but he managed to find out about this credit line. He went to the bank, got a credit line. He managed to he converted his coal-fired oven to a gas-fired oven, and his bakery became very successful, one of the most successful bakeries. But what it showed that when we then rolled out the second credit line, in the second round of credit lines, we didn't need that concessional finance to train the banks because they already knew how to assess it. We needed a little bit more incentives to bring more entrepreneurs to come in. The third credit line, we didn't need that either because now everyone knew that this was around and it was profitable to do on their own. When we then went to other countries like Estonia, for example, in Estonia, all the banks had already taken on these credit lines and were lending because there were sort of low-hanging fruits out there that could be. So I think one has to think cleverly how you combine, on the one hand, concessional finance. We will know it's in very short supply, and we need to use it cleverly, and finding mechanisms to reach the kind of people and companies that you're talking about. And that's also, I think, how we have to think as a development bank. How can we channel into specific we focus mostly on infrastructure. Of course, infrastructure also helps those people, if they want to travel to sell their goods and so on. And if they can do it in a more energy efficient way, that's also something that is a contribution and something that maybe can also help them develop their businesses. We need to think again how we use, concessional funding and clever instruments of a private sector. Anyone else? Yeah. I think they need to hear you. Also, it's being live streamed, so you have to.
Hi. Hello. Wait, hello. Yeah, I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
No, I can hear you, but
Oh, okay. Hi, yeah, it's Cici. I'm from Asia, but now I'm working in Africa, so I'm quite interested because I know like AIIB is also increasing the footprint in Africa, like a lot of increasing portfolio. So I also want to understand like what's AIIB's unique value proposition in this, like in Africa compared with, for example, like AFDB or World Bank. Like, is it like more focused on the partnership between Asia and Africa or something else?
Well, you know, we are a regional bank focusing on Asia, but we also have invest outside Asia. What we say is that outside Asia, we want to focus on investments that contribute to global public goods, so climate-related investments, and we also want to have some connection to Asia, contributing to increasing trade with Asia, for example, and so on. So you know, yes, we are increasing our investments in Africa. We are very present in Egypt. Danny spoke a bit about some of the things we are doing here. We are very excited about, you know, particularly what we're doing in the renewables, for example, here, and you know that there are huge opportunities here for us to also to work with other MDBs to learn about this part of the world.
Just like another question.
Yeah.
I'm really curious. Like, so AIIB is also, I mean, a big big part of the stakeholders in global climate governance, and that's why I guess that's why AIIB is joining this event like COP every year. So I was just wondering like how the countries negotiate, like they are on the negotiation table and they're like having conferences every day here, and how would they have any impact on AIIB's operations here, like in the very specific approaches?
Maybe I can say a few words, and maybe Danny can complement. So obviously I think you know how AIIB, we have a board, and we have a lot of discussions on our board about these issues. We just had a discussion about the revision of our energy strategy, where we made very important adjustments reflecting what we have learned about climate and what we have learned about what needs to be done, the urgency of something. So we have changed our perspective on what we work on in the energy sector. Obviously, that happens in a dialogue with our member states. Danny, who is in his previous capacity was responsible for the dialogue with our countries, and of course now also in his current capacity deals a lot with. Maybe you can say a few more words about how you think about these this dialogue and how we try to learn and influence it.
Okay, thank you. Is this one working? Yes, it is.
Yeah,
Thank you very much for the question. So, I mean, I think part of your question was about how the country's negotiating here at the COP. I've never been involved in those negotiations directly, but as a UN body, the UNFCCC has all 190 or so UN members, and in the end, they have to reach agreement unanimously on the important items under discussion. And so I know that the negotiators are regularly in their meetings till 4 o'clock in the morning, covering important areas. And in the end, of course, like every negotiation, it requires compromise on all sides. So last year in Glasgow, COP26, there were, I think, new agreements made in quite a wide range of areas, and that really required, the developing countries to work together. And lots of challenges there, because developing countries rightly were holding the developed countries to account for the failure to meet some of the financial commitments that they had made. There was also a lot of discussion about coal and fossil fuels and so forth. So all those issues come together in the end in the final negotiations. It's why this event goes on for 2 weeks, because those things have to be discussed stage by stage and step by step. So it's a little bit different to in the context of AIIB. We have our own board of directors. Each director represents a group of countries, and although we normally operate by consensus, you know, it is possible to proceed even if not every member is 100% in support of a particular an initiative or project. And so, in a sense, for a financial institution which is deploying money to support development objectives which have been agreed when the institution is found, that more efficient governance model is crucially important. And AIIB has been seeking to develop further our governance in a more efficient way. But for a global negotiation like this, where you need to have all the, you need to have action of different kinds based on the principle of common and differentiated responsibilities taken in many different countries, then having all the countries of the world coming together in the end around a common agreement is very, very important. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
but I'm happy to try.
maybe I should add. So also that you said that we are at the COPs. This is actually the second COP that we are at, and so we are a new institution, and we have just become observer status at the UN. We take this collaboration with the UN very seriously, and think that we have a lot to learn and create interesting opportunities for us to interact with Gerald. Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We very much appreciate you coming here, and look forward to interacting with you in the future as well. Thank you.